Good to be back here at React Bangalore, that is React Online now. And yeah, so the topic, actually, we came up with this topic in a Twitter reply. Actually, it was, I saw Reactify tweet that they were looking for speakers, and then they were looking for topics. And then I came up with a few of them, and this was selected. I totally forgot about a lot of things, but yeah, here we are. And I think from a series of things that we have been doing, the streams and the talks or Twitter spaces, this is going to be a sort of like gist or a summary of all those things. Great. So does your app need a global state? That's the question. A little bit about me. I'm Sanket, and I'm a co-founder at Geekians and also software engineer at Geekians. Geekians is a community-driven company, and we are very active in React, React Native, and the entire OSS scene here in Bangalore and in India, or maybe around that. Great, and we are building native base right now. I'm personally building. Geekians is doing a lot more things, but me and my team that I work with on a daily basis, we are working on building native base version 3. And I could relate to all the talks before this. The first one, I think, the last talk by Vikram on accessibility, that is being taken care here in native base version 3. Then also by Apurv. Apurv talked about how to build a code editor in the browser. And we are building a builder sort of thing around native base that will announce maybe in a couple of months. That uses a lot of practices, but I have to look at ES build and also Skypack that Apurv mentioned. We are using something like Rollup and a like custom configuration of Rollup with the builder that we are building. And also use SWR is that Megha talked about. I'm going to like elaborate a little bit there as well. And yeah, Vipul talked about bridging the gap between design and code. That's my favorite part. So I'm happy that I'm on the last. But yeah, you can go ahead and follow me on Twitter. I go by the handle Sanket Sahu. And yeah, so does your app need a global state? That's a question. So app can be a really large thing to talk about. So I've rephrased it. Does your component need the global state? If you're building components, do you want that component to speak to the global state, or can it directly say make API calls and fetch it and show it on the screen? So let's see. The answer to this is it depends, and that's the end of my talk. Not really. Let's elaborate on what that it depends mean. So let me go back. I have some drawings on Excalidraw, so I think that would be sufficient. Yeah, great. So does your component need the access to the global state? What is state management? Pretty straightforward. I think everybody who works with all these front-end libraries and frameworks, they have a fair bit of idea of what a state is. So whenever you create a variable and drive your user interface with that variable or data, that is the state part of your application. In context of React, it would be use state. Context, yeah, metaphor. So in context of React, it can also be context. So your state can be driven. The local state of the component is driven by use state. And if you want something like a global thing, you would probably use something like the context, the React's context. So going to the gist of this talk, or the question, or the things I'm going to talk about. So this is my research, and everything boils down to the what your requirement is and what you want to build. So I highly recommend not to draw straight away conclusions that this library is good or this library is bad, or this is performant and this is not. The ultimate answer is totally it depends. It's funny, but it's true. Let's explore what exactly do we have here. So first of all, why is it important to manage state in your app? The front end has got more powerful, but back in the days when we had like backend driven apps or backend driven pages, the front end didn't have to do the heavy lifting. But with the evolution, the front end is now more powerful. If you see something like Next.js Live, they run the entire npm and like the entire bundler and the entire environment using all those web workers and WASM and whatnot. So the front end is really powerful. And now the front end is doing most of the things. Backend is mere takes in a request and then saves the data and then gives it back. So anything that is shared across devices and across the internet, that is handled by the backend. But anything beyond that, most of the things are handled in the front end itself. So uh, it's important that we handle the data part of your application and manage it well so that it's performant and it's structured. So the first one is definitely about the front end being more powerful and the front end driving the entire user interface based on the data that it receives or it computes based on say API calls or the user interaction or anything like that. And then when we have like shared data between components, then we need to have like a central state or something like that. So let's talk about local versus global state management. So local, when we use state, that is localized to a component. Global, when there are two or three components and they want to like get an access to the same source of data. So there are multiple ways how we can do the global state management. Probably we can drill it down from the top level to all the components down there, but in that case we'll end up in a lot of like props passing and then calling callbacks up the tree. So it becomes really tedious. So we might need something like a global state management, and most of the apps use it with React. So use state works for most of the cases. We lift up the state to the parent when needed, and we move to a global state, something like Redux or Mobex or say context. We move to that in particular cases when we need the access throughout the application. And so let's talk about different scenarios. Like we have forms, toggle button, animations, odd data, shopping cart, and table. So where do we store the data of a form? So we can store the data of a form localized to a component. Say if you have something like a username and password login form, then the validation logic that needs to drive the entire form, so that can be local to that component itself. But if we need the form data that to if that form affects the other parts of your app, then probably we need to pull it up in a global state. So in most of the cases with forms, it's local state and then it is synced back to the global state once the form is validated or submitted. That's the strategy that we use with forms. Toggle button, again, it can, if the toggle button is changing everything, say for example dark mode or light mode, if you have a toggle, so in that case it's better to keep the dark mode and the boolean variable that drives the color mode into a global namespace. But something like the checkbox that you get under a form, that I accept terms and conditions, in that case it's local to the form. uh, Animation, so animation is mostly local, and we don't usually do like interruptible animations in most of the cases. But if we are doing interruptible animation, that means uh, if you want to intercept the behavior of animation based on some other factor, in that case you might need that animation to be controlled from a global level. But most of the animations like say accordion or some animation on the form, say on the button, it can be local. Most of the animations are local. In case of auth data, I think this is most of the time global, that you save the logged in user details in a global state and make all the components accessible to that global state. Shopping cart is again something similar that needs to go global, because you might have a dedicated page for shopping cart and then you have like different pages wherein you add to cart and then get read from the shopping cart if that item is added in the shopping cart or not. Then at the top you might need to show the total number of items in your cart or something like that. So shopping cart is mostly global. And then we have data tables. Data tables can be local, but if there are cases that a data row needs to be in sync with everything in the entire app, which usually happens so that you don't have like stale data, In that case, you might need a global layer wherein you store and normalize everything and store at a global level and take a reference of that in your data table. But in most of the cases, data table are built such that the data that is being fetched in the data table is usually local. So yeah, so that's about these cases. Then there are specific cases, say multi-step forms. So that may need global state, because you might want user to go through different routes and then sync that back to the global state. Yeah, I think editing forms, that needs to keep a copy, and whenever we are done with the forms, we should sync it back to the global if that affects any part of the global state. And yeah, when using form, avoid messing the global state. Yeah, that's how most of the form libraries are doing it, except the ones that is driven by Redux, because it has to link to the global store of Redux. But libraries like, I think, React Hook Forms and Formic are, they use the local state itself. All right, moving on. So how state management changes with different use cases. So the front end is evolving, even like with if we use create react app, in that case it's more like uh, everything is on the front end and it just fetches the entire app in the first go, and then nothing is sent or read from the backend. So in case of create react app, it might be a little different, but in case of server side rendered apps, something like Next.js, that the default config of Next.js, like every page gets to hit the server, and you can do something on the server right there and prepare the entire page and send it back. So there is a bit of difference when you are doing like API calls or anything like that between create React app and Next.js, or say single page application versus server side rendered apps, because uh, server-side rendered apps are dynamic. It can have a backend piece. It can have a dynamic data fetching as well. So something like get server-side props. If you are confident on using that, you can use that function to fetch most of the, say, API call or the data that that particular route needs. But that's not the case with create React app or something when we have the routing in the front end, wherein we will need to fetch things when the component is, or when the screen is mounted, or when the route is changed on the front end. So that's a bit different. So the question is, should we store the response from the server in the global state when we are using create React app? And how is hooks making us worry less about it? I want to touch upon a little bit on use SWR that Megha talked about. So use SWR is really nice. It's nice on the philosophy more than the library itself. That it feels like you are fetching something on the component itself, but it goes through its own layer that is global on your app level. So use SWR is a library that is used to fetch data in your components, and you can drop in a link, and then you get the JSON data, and then you can wire up the data that is fetched from use SWR in your component. It supports caching. It supports like you can have something like set interval and refetch and things like that, which is really nice, which feels like you're doing everything in the local component itself. But the if you look at the architecture, use SWR has its own layer, and it handles all the responses from the server at its own layer, where it can cache things. So if you are using use SWR at in two different components, they are trying to fetch the same URL, it would pick it up from the cache and show it right away on the screen. So use SWR or hooks in general, any state management around hooks, it feels that it's local, but it is really easy to pull it up at the global level without changing the APIs at the local component level, which is really nice. I love this about hooks. Hmm. Like if you go back to the days when people just use Redux, we used to like send everything to Redux, to the global state. And we had to think a little bit about like where the data is being stored and where data is being fetched from and how it is wired up in the component. With something like use SWR, you don't have to think about all those things, but in a way it is doing all those things. So that is really magical about hooks, that feels local but it is global. It is very similar to use mutation and use query of Apollo client as well. So you can say use mutation and use query. These are the counterparts to use SWR. So this is REST versus GraphQL sort of thing. Yeah. So a lot of things to think about around like how you're fetching your data and where you're storing it, and do you have a caching layer. So all these things matter a lot when you're deciding if you want to go global or you want to stay local to your component. Then comes Jamstack. So I think this is very much related to the previous point itself. So when you don't have a server side rendered app, you have to make all the API calls in the front end. And Jamstack stands for JavaScript API and markup. This is a stack that can be hosted on a static storage, which does not have a dynamic backend piece. So this is much like create React app. So the question is, like, how does it change if we are using Jamstack versus something like a server-side rendered app? So in Jamstack, we have to manually handle all the data, and it's handled in the front end. Whereas in case of server-side rendered apps like Next.js, we can do a part of it. The data that the entire route or the page needs, it can be sent back to the backend, and the query can be in the backend using some function like say get server-side props. So yeah, a lot of things to wrap your head around it, but yeah, that's the like high level idea. Okay. So what are the options that we have when it comes to state management? Uh, Obviously Redux, and then we have a bunch of other things. So let's see. So Redux, and then we have Redux Toolkit, which is a wrapper around Redux that simplifies the entire workflow of Redux. So I really like it that you can write your reducers and the default state and the actions around it in one single place using Redux Toolkit. And then we have Zustand and Jotai and Recoil and React's context, and something that we built as well, Sync State. This is a shameless plug. And yeah, I've kept Mobux as a separate thing here because Mobux is a bit different when we compare all these. Uh, I can talk about each one of them and give a high level idea about the differences. So all these are based on functional programming paradigm, whereas Mobux is something you can say that it's more like object oriented paradigm. But we have something like Mobux state tree that is the perfect marriage between object oriented paradigm and functional. So you can use all the like great advantages of object oriented programming, like you can mutate things and you can create relationships between your objects using Mobux state tree. But under the hood, Mobux state tree handles everything at a functional level. So I'm a big fan of Mobux state tree personally. But the industry, people are using Redux Toolkit a lot. I see for most of the use cases context as well being used. And Recoil was announced at React Europe, but I have not seen a lot of people using Recoil. And yeah, I see Zustand being used a lot. I saw it in a couple of projects that I was working on, and it's pretty neat. Zustand is like feels like local state management, and the magic of hooks make it like a global state management. So yeah, go ahead and try it out. I think we missed X state, which should be here, but yeah. So these are the options. Don't get too confused what to use and what not to use. You can get a high level understanding of each one of them and see which one works for your use case. For most of the use case, I think Redux Toolkit works very well. Mobux state tree as well works really well if you have a bit idea about like object oriented paradigm. And yeah, Zustand is also being getting some traction these days. So Zustand, Redux Toolkit, Mobux state tree. These are my picks. And yeah, so that's a very high level idea about like the options that we have right now with the state management solutions in 2021. So the next thing I want to touch upon is, can we mix and match various implementation techniques? Like, can we mix, say, context with, say, Zusten or Redux, or maybe Redux and Mobux? So the answer to this is is that X plus Y is not good, but that may be your use case. Like you can use Redux and Mobux in your same project. So the question that you need to ask is, how does the bundle size get inflated when you have like multiple state management libraries? Is your team comfortable with the philosophies of different state management solutions? The problem that you're trying to solve, which particular state management solution or philosophy makes more sense? For example, if you are building a design tool, then I think object oriented paradigm makes more sense, uh, because it's more performant in terms of you are using more of imperative API than declarative API, and you are re-rendering things when you need. But in case of most of the CRUD apps or dashboard apps that we build, functional programming paradigm works really well. Something like Redux would be just fine, or Zusten just would be just fine. Mixing things, if you have like two different parts of the app that is like totally different than each other, but they are like co-located, or maybe in different routes, in that case you can have like different teams working on each one of the module, and it makes sense to have like different state management for like different modules of your app. And context, using React's context is totally fine with anything else, because this comes built in with React. So go ahead and use it, maybe for color mode, dark mode, and all those things can be stored directly straight away in context without any other state management library. Yeah. So the answer to all these questions would always be, it depends on what you're trying to build, and like which library you want to use. So I have tried to summarize it, that what considerations do we make before selecting a library. uh, so these are the considerations that I could come through. The first one is use case, what your project needs, what's your requirement like. Is it, say, something that is, say, distributed? Is it real time use case? Are you building a chat app? Are you building a design tool? Are you using a dashboard, or a plain static, say, landing page? So use case is the first thing. Documentation, can you find the things that you're looking for? Do you understand the philosophies? So documentation is the second part. Then the third is examples, so that you can go through the recipes, copy and paste, and quickly learn through things. That's what we do: copy paste and then try to like tweak things around, and see if you can build things. Then fourth one would be learning curve, and understanding the basics and getting off the ground. And then we have the lines of code, like, say, to do something really trivial, are you writing a lot of code? Is there a lot of boilerplate code? Is there a lot many files that you need to touch upon? So that could also be one consideration. And no, I'm not trying to paint Redux black in this point. Then we have philosophy and design principles, the community. And yeah, community does not mean number of stars on GitHub. uh, it's definitely a bit of factor there, but it can also be because of the age of that library. Something that is new but it's rising might not have a lot of GitHub stars. So try to find the community of the library around the library that you're going to use. Then flexibility of modification, is it like too tightly coupled with a lot of things, or can you jump in and like make changes to it or modify it? That's very important. And last, I think this should be the last point, that knowledge and experience of the team. Usually this is like the number one thing that people just directly straight away jump on, and then say we don't have any knowledge or expertise or experience on that particular library that you're suggesting. But these libraries, they take like a day or two to learn, or max a week, right? So always keep this at the lower bottom, I would say. People usually uh, develop a bias with the library towards and against that they are using or they're not using. So I think this is very important that we very open about the libraries that's available out there. Try to understand the architecture and the high level, like the surface API of those libraries, and not like go like too strong about I want to use this and this is the best thing, right? So always keep this as the last point, knowledge and experience of the team. Okay, so what's next? So how does the state management implementation change with the introduction of serverless application? I think, yeah. So serverless applications, I think it does not matter a lot because anyway we are doing APIs and talking to that. Uh, so yeah, it doesn't matter too much. Then when do we introduce state management libraries in our project? Do we do it at the bootstrapping? Do we do it when we need it, or when exactly do we do it? So I think it should be when we are architecting the app. I think we usually start a new project with something in our mind, and I think the theme can be set really early on. It's good if you can install the libraries and set the best practices and the ESLint rules or TSLint rules in the project right when you start, rather than evolving it when with the project, because that gets sets the ground right for the project. There can be cases when you may need new libraries to be introduced with new features coming in, but it's always good to do it at the project bootstrapping time. So, what's the conclusion? Which state management library should you use? Should you use local state or the global state? So, the answer is it depends. All right, I think that's all from my side. And yeah, get in touch with me if you need anything. You want to chat about any particular topic around state management, accessibility, UI, React. I'm available. My DMs are open. I go by the Twitter handle Sanket Sahu. Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you so much. Okay. And